Hi, boys and girls. I hope you're having a great day. We are going to have a fun little science experiment today for small groups. So you should have a piece of paper that looks like this. And it says on the top, sink. See the big S up here? That's S for sink and F for float, right? Sink or float. So in this column right here and this one, it's going to make us guess whether we think one of the objects will sink to the bottom or float on the top. Okay, then you should have a baggie full of all kinds of objects like mine right here, like this. Let's see if you can see it. Let me put it down so you can see it. So you should have all kinds of objects like this, okay, to put in the bucket of water. And then you also need a pencil and you need a bucket of water for this experiment, okay? So I'm going to show you my bucket of water right here. Okay, this is my bucket of water. Okay? I'm going to hold it down so you guys can see whether it's going to sink or float. Okay? So the first thing I want you to do is at the very top, you should see a picture of a marble. Okay? At the very top of your paper, there should be a picture of a marble. Let's look at our paper. See at the top, there's a marble. So do we think the marble's going to sink or do we think it's going to float? Let's feel it. Maybe if it's heavy, it's going to sink. If it's light, it's going to float. So let's feel it. What do you think it's going to do? Let's say sink, okay? So if you guess sink, you're going to put an X in this box right next to sink. If you think it's going to float, you're going to put an X next to the F in float on this box, okay? So let's put your X on that box. And then on the very end of that row, we're going to try it out and see what actually happened. So let's get our marble ready, okay? And I'll put this down so you can see. Do we think it's going to sink or float? Ready? Sink, right? It sinks to the bottom. See it? It's down here on the bottom. So sink. So now you're going to take your pencil and your paper and go right across that same line and look for the S for sink. This says S for sink. So I'm going to put an X right in that box. So we guessed it right, right? And it's okay if you don't guess it right, right? See, we guessed sink and sink really happened. Okay, it's okay if you don't get it right, right? Remember when we learn, that's how we learn, is by thinking of something that might happen and then it doesn't happen, right? Or making a mistake. That's how we learn. So the next picture down should be your pattern blocks. And these are pattern blocks. So you might have a couple of them in your packet. I think I put a few of them in. So do you feel them? Do you think they're going to sink? Do you think they're going to float? What do you think? Take a guess. Okay, so if you say float, you're going to put your X in float. And if you think sink, you're going to put your X in that box right next to the pattern blocks. Okay, so do that right now. And then we'll try them out. Okay, I'll put this down and we'll try them out. So let's see. I'm going to put these two first and see what happens. Ready? Ooh, one sinks and one floats. What about this one? I'm going to try one more. So that's a tricky one. So I have one that floats and the other two sink. So I think I'm going to put an X in both boxes because that's a tricky one. It does both. It sinks and floats. So then I'm going to go right to the end of this one. I'm going to put an X here and an X here. Okay? See how I put two? Because it did sink and it did float. The next thing is a what? What's that picture of? Spoon, right? So we're going to do the spoon. And remember, you guess first whether you think that's called predicting. Can you say predicting? That's called predicting. So we're going to predict if the spoon is going to sink or float. What do you think? Sink or float? I'm going to say float. That's my guess. So if you put float, remember, put your X in your float box or your X in your sink box if you think it's going to sink. And then we're going to try it out. Ready? What happens? It floats, right? It floats. So then we're going to put it over here. Remember, follow that line in that boxes. And we're going to put it right over there because it floats. Okay, then we're going to go to the next one, which is rubber band. Do the same thing. Guess, do we think it's going to sink or do we think it's going to float? Guess which one. Sink or float. And then we're going to try it out. What do we think? That's a tricky one. It floats, but it's halfway up and halfway down. Do you see it? It sinks and floats, all kind of a little bit of both. But I'm going to say float because it's not quite touching the bottom. See how it's not touching the bottom? It's going up and down. So we're going to put an X on float for that one. Okay, this is float right here. So we're going to go to rubber band, and the very last box on that row next to rubber band is float because that's what actually happened. What about toothpick? Toothpick is made of what? Do you know what toothpicks are made of? They're made of wood. So do we know? Do you think wood sinks or do you think wood floats? I don't know. So take a guess what you think it is. And then you put your X on your guess, remember? And then try it out. So let's put your X on the box and then we'll try it out together. Let's see if it's going to sink or float. Do you see it? It floats, right? It floats. Right on the top. It floats. So now go to all the way to the end of your line. We have a lot of things that float, huh? What about a crayon? And I have two different. You have one in your packet, but I brought two. I have one really big crayon and one littler crayon. And do we think they're both going to do the same thing? I don't know. We'll try it out. So what do you think is going to happen with your crayon? Do you think your crayon will sink or do you think your crayon will float? Remember, guess on your box first. S for sink, F for float. I'm going to say sink. Let's see if that's really what happens. I'll say sink. So let's try the first one. Let's try this one. See if it sinks. Oh, it does. It sinks right to the bottom. Do you see it way down there? There's the bottom. Well, what about the big one? Do we think the big one's going to sink or float? Ready? Sink. It sinks too, right? So they both sink. So it doesn't matter if it's big or small. They both sink. So then you go on your line, right? All the way over here to sink. And put our X right there. Penny. You might not have a penny. You might have a nickel or a quarter, right? I gave you a coin in your packet. So let's guess what our coin is going to do. Feel it and look at it. Do you think it's going to sink or float? Let's predict. Let's say float. I think it's going to float. So you put an X in the float box and let's try it out. What do we think? Uh-oh, it doesn't float, it sinks, right? Sinks. I guessed wrong, but that's okay, right? So it sinks. So gonna put an X in your sink box. The next thing on your sheet is paper clip. This is the paper clip. Do you think the paper clip's gonna sink or do you think the paper clip's gonna float? Sorry, my head was itching. Sink or float? What do we think? Paper clip. Sink or float? Okay, I'm going to guess. I say float. Let's see if it floats because it feels really light. What do you think? Okay, let's try it out. Oh, it sinks to the bottom. It sinks. So even though it's really light, it sinks to the bottom. It's made of metal, so maybe that's why it goes all the way to the bottom, even though it's really light, right? Now, tinfoil. Tinfoil is this sparkly paper, shiny paper, okay? That's called tinfoil. What do you think tinfoil is? Feel it. Is it heavy? Is it light? Do we think it will sink or float? Okay, let's put our guess on our paper. And then we'll try it out. Let's see what happens. I say float. Let's see if that's what happens. Does it sink or float? Floats, right? It stays on the top, floats. I'm going to put an X in float because that's what actually happened. And then the last one on your paper is a dice, right? A die. This is a die, and it might be a different shaped die than you're used to, but I gave you something new in your packet. So do you think this will sink to the bottom, or do you think it's going to float on top? Feel it, think about it, and then make your guess on your paper. Okay? And then we're going to try it out. Let's see. Oh, that went fast. Sink. Sink to the bottom, right? So it sinks. So then on the very bottom, you're going to put your last X in the box for sink. Okay? Why don't we count them out? I brought 2 paper plates. So you don't have this in your packet, but I thought we could do it together. So this one says S for sink. See the objects are on the bottom? Sink means on the bottom. And this one says F for float on the top. Okay, so let's count out the things that float first, and I'll put them in this plate. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we have 5 things that float. See, all our floats. And let's see how many sink, and then we'll see which one we think has more. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So 8 things. Which is more? Which has more? 8 or 5? 8, right? So we had more things that sunk to the bottom, right? We have more things on sink. And then we do on float. So that's an experiment you can do with all kinds of different things in your house. You might have a couple extra things in your packet, like a button or a straw. So try to guess what you think will happen and then try it out. It's a fun thing that you can do with all kinds of things in your house. You could get a paper plate and go pick up or a regular plate and go pick out all kinds of things in your bedroom, some toys, some other things, some spoons, and make sure you ask your parents if you can use them. And then you could try it out on your own experiment, whether you think it's going to sink or float. But remember, always try to guess. Remember, prediction. You guess what's going to happen and then you try it out. Okay? That's part of being a scientist. And you guys are all being scientists by playing sink or float. I hope you guys have a great day, and I will see you soon. Bye.